So actually, I thought I could perhaps start with some observations on the film, and we could start a discussion from there and throw it open to the floor, perhaps. Yeah. So one of the things that I thought were particularly striking, given the sort of narrative, the scale of the narrative that you're dealing with, uh, rather than looking at this huge socio-economic political reality of this particular context that you're looking at, you chose to focus on a very micro sort of a story, right? So one also has an experience of this kind of a large-scale change that's happening, essentially through the experience of the two families. So the narrative arc of the film sort of also makes you realize the politics or the socio-economic sort of politics of the context in a certain way. So I was wondering if you would like to speak a little bit about why this approach towards this micro narrative, because even visually, and we can talk about it later, I thought that was really interesting how you're constantly juxtaposing the family vis-a-vis, say, the mill or the desolated mill or the skyscraper sort of a city landscape that we see. So would you like to start with that, perhaps, that why this micro story?
Of course. I think just to save time, if I could answer the questions directly, I would explain as much as I can. If any questions are addressed specifically to the director Wang Yang on the creative process or his approach, I will be able to translate. So, regards to our choice in the direction that we took, I think it all came as a result of the whole 6-year production process. At the beginning of the film, at the beginning of the production, we really had no idea how we wanted to approach, how we wanted to take on this gigantic area when it's going to be demolished. And it's also in fact, a very personal place for the director Wang Yang, whose uncle lived and worked there for many years, and he used to live there as a child. Also, my aunt also worked in one of the factory plants. So the location has a deep connection to the local people. It was an economic hub from the 50s, I think, all the way to close to the end of the 80s. So for us, at first, we just wanted to, without knowing and pretty much nothing, we just thought it's important to capture it. And as we started filming, we met these two incredible families. In fact, in the same way how you guys experienced meeting them in the film, the first, the opening scene, the head of the village, Xi'an, the grandmother, she walked into the camera. We didn't plan this, and she just started to speak to us so honestly about what was happening. So we were just drawn to her, and we followed her into her house. She invited us in and shared her family stories with us. But of course, slowly we had to build the trust to let them really reveal their relationships and also get used to a group of young people not doing very much and just visiting them every day. So I think it wasn't so much of a creative decision. It was really the experience of being affected by these two families, and we really felt, instead of taking it a broadcasting approach like we discussed, discussed earlier, we really felt the most authentic way to express what these people are experiencing and what's really happening to ordinary people in China. We thought that was the best way than figures and narrations and having a voice of authority to tell the situation.
Right, but I'm also wondering, when you decide to work on a form like this, particularly in documentary, when families are sort of opening themselves out to you, and actually in this very, very transparent sort of a way, because they're kind of arguing, they're sharing their anxieties with you. There's so much happening, right? And some of it perhaps is also being propelled by your presence, as a crew, that you're there with your camera. And I also realize it's a very minimal crew that you're shooting with, right? Which you can see in your image making. It sort of comes across. Were there, I'm wondering, while shooting, and actually more so while editing, what were the kind of dilemmas that you all had in terms of, like, whether they're ethical dilemmas or that crossing the line of, keeping a certain sort of a distance from your character, so to speak? I'm sure there were these kind of, discussions that took place, especially at the editing table, if not on the shoot. So if you could share a little bit about that, I think it would be very insightful, because a lot of us are students of cinema, so it could be a very insightful sort of a thing, yeah?
So regards to, I think I'll tell a bit first, and then I think he will have some interesting stories to share as well. I think just as it's also part of the creative process was, and how the film was shaped was precisely the ethical choice. In fact, what we were able to capture was a lot more, what should I say, multidimensional. The reality of these people, the pain they were suffering, in fact, was a lot harsher. There's a deeper layers of families, dispute, betrayal, anger, and hidden stories against each other. And as we were learning these, we were still in our 20s while we were making this film. Now we have white hair on our head. But as we were learning these people's life experiences, and we questioned a lot on how we should represent these people, and how and what the audience would perceive as well, because if we just cut the film or present the film honestly, as which we tried at first, it was just too depressing, and it felt like these are people with bad intentions, which is not true. Not because we're all multi-dimensional beings. We're capable of good and bad, but to be able to tell a standalone film that has a life of its own, we thought the only compass that could guide us was at least giving these people the dignity of a normal human being, because as filmmakers, when you're raising funding and pitching the project to broadcasters' funds, it's very easy to be tempted and guided to tell a story that has a flair, has a big concept, has some kind of drama. But the more we looked into ourselves and consciousness deeper, the more we thought, instead of taking the money and please the broadcasters, which most of the documentary films are benefited by, we thought we had to stand our ground and make the creative choice that this is the most authentic way for us to tell the story. It was a very long process, and before making the film, of course, I had some kind of concept of the story I wanted to tell, and just to establish a creative framework. But the deeper I dove into this production, the more I realized what the power of documentary, which is to touch people on a personal level, and once I realized that, it was like it was a process of evolution. The film really changed bit by bit, and led to where we are towards the end. Yeah.
So actually, one thing that I was particularly struck by in the film is, and perhaps I mean both of you could answer this, is also the way you look at the idea of the body. Yeah, so the human body, and maybe this is a reading of the film, but and pardon me for that, but yeah, but that's one of my takeaways in terms of the visual language that the film sort of uses, either by default or plan. I'm not sure. But for instance, the way the fact that you look at these old people, and there are these two particular sequences in the film. One where the old lady is walking in her crutch, and she's kind of very tentative while she's walking. And then you cut to the factory, the desolate factory. And there's another particular cut where you're looking at a close-up of the old lady, and then you cut to the spools in the factory. And I was wondering if there was any sort of if this was a strain, this idea of the body, the human body, and the dead machine, if these were sort of ideas that at any point informed your visual language, because I see that happening once or twice in the narrative. So I was wondering if it happened by default, or was it, I don't know, was it something that was thought about? Because it's an interesting parallel, at least. It's an interesting reading for me of the film. So, yeah.
I think I can answer this as the editor.
Sure.
When you edit the film, you really look for visual cues, visual connections that somehow can perhaps add a deeper meaning or add a new meaning, finding new meanings to with the footage you have. And when we were shooting the film, and I think what drew us the most was the visual of this location. It's the factory is spectacularly huge, and that's only one plant you saw. There are 5 plants in that area, and 1 extra dyeing plant. So 5 manufacturing plant, 1 dyeing plant, and there's a power station nearby. So this whole, it's like a city, basically. So we were all struck by the immensity of this place. But then what really touched us were these people, and they are very small when they're working in these factories. And the location of this self-built village, which is really rare in China nowadays because everything is standardized. It's all just vertical flats everywhere, same shape, same color, no characters whatsoever. And we were just looking at those houses, those details somehow has, you sense humanity, and you get a sense of their personalities. So I guess visually it's always just trying to link those two things, because they by themselves has a lot of emotions. And when we were trying to make each scene work, is really just to find those connections and make you feel something. Right. It's not a deliberate choice. It's not trying to create symbols or meanings, but hopefully just to have a visceral reaction, or hopefully, absolutely. Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting actually in the film, because it's like you said, it's not foregrounded. Yes. It's actually for you to experience as you're watching the film, and also because this is a film about also aging and old age in a certain way, yeah? And people who've aged, and factories which have aged, and what is what is the idea of value or worthfulness in a sense, or in a larger philosophical sense. I mean, these were some of my takeaways from the film, which I thought was very enriching. But I was also wondering, on the same note, it's very tempting perhaps when you're doing this sort of a people-based kind of a form, to kind of dig into, for the lack of a better word, to dig into the idea of memory in a certain way. Yeah. So, for instance, I mean, usually in a storytelling form like this, you'd see a lot of old photographs. You'd see the workers. I'm sort of using cliches, but the worker badges. You'd sort of try and evoke memory in a particular way. Yeah? But again, I thought that was a very interesting cinematic choice, that you guys actually stay within the present. So the cinematic, you're experiencing a cinematic present in the narrative as well, right? So there's only at one point, I think, where you refer to this old photograph of the person who was a worker, one of the gentlemen. Again, I was wondering, like, as storytellers, is this something that was it a conscious choice, or did you not have access to that other material, or why was it left out of the edit?
It's a conscious creative decision, right. In fact. When we first started developing this film, because we knew the significant history of this place, where it holds a very strong symbolic value of being this symbol of the communist, the good old communist era, and but then there's the turbulent period when the Cultural Revolution happened, and the workers were really, the workers' families were really broken apart, and then the decline of state-owned factories, the rise of Chinese manufacturing from the private sectors. All these we could tell with the location and the subject matter given, but the director Wang decided to tell these family stories. In fact, it's a very intimate and very small level stories, which were not very popular and liked by most of the broadcasters actually, was because he felt it's how us living in the contemporary world today, that this is how we experience history. So to understand past history is in fact experiencing what's happening now, and so we have to find a way to film something that's concrete and something that's tangible, and use that to create a link or create a suggestive storytelling for the people who experience the film. Hopefully will raise questions and be intrigued to learn a bit more about China, about what happened, and about how the past shapes who we are today. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting choice actually, and perhaps a brave one at that. Yeah. And just to sort of add to what you're saying, I think what also really works is the durationality of the film. So here is a film which I can't imagine can be any shorter in terms of duration. It's also the duration which allows you to experience the characters in a particular way. You know, you sort of start moving with them, and the initial doubts that you're sort of having about how they're being represented kind of dissipate, come back again. So I think it's interesting to kind of also look at what duration does to this form of storytelling. And in that context, it's also, I mean, I also thought it was kind of surprising that a film which actually could have been very sad or hopeless in a way. And I think you have one sequence which at least I thought was perhaps, putting it badly, but was perhaps the only optimistic sequence, which is the girl on the rooftop, and when she's sort of weeding out the things and she sees the plants coming out. That's actually the only sequence, in a sense, which directly talks about a future, perhaps metaphorically, but in some ways, right? But despite that, despite the fact that it's actually a story of struggle, one didn't necessarily feel hopeless by the end of the film in some ways. But so I was also wondering about this choice of actually not overusing the factory, and in the edit especially. You know, so the present is always punctuated by one sort of either a long shot or a track or of the factory, right? But otherwise you don't, which you could, because it's very tempting. It's a very tempting environment, right? And even in terms of the camera and image, it can be a fascinating image. So that idea of keeping it really minimal, I wonder, like, what kind of discussion sort of informed that editorial choice?
Well, sorry to disappoint you on that, because we only had one day to shoot at the factory. We were only allowed for one day, because they, you know, they are getting closed down. They don't want media people to go in. We really had to find like inside people to introduce us and pretend, oh, we're film students, and we wanted to shoot something for our relatives, and yeah. So we had had no other choice, unfortunately.
Actually, the reason I wondered about that also was because the shots are so composed, in the sense that, I mean, they're tracks, and a track takes time, right? Or they're like still static shots, or so you can't tell that you were shooting in a hurry. So congratulations to your camera person.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. But just to be a bit more specific, sure. The shots of the worker inside the factory working, that was one day. And at the very early stage of development, so way back before the film was got any funding, we had also one day to film the tracks. So that we didn't know what we were doing. So, and the factory wasn't getting demolished at the time. Right. So they were a bit loose, and we managed to do a bit of dolly shots. Right. and we used their carts, which was being used to transport heavy bags. So it was very stable.
Yes,
so
yes.
it's good dolly.
Yeah, it's good dolly.
Yes, yes.
Good improvisation. Yes.
Yeah, and one more day when the factory was completely demolished. That was that was in 2016. So that was when all the workers moved out. Everything got shut down. And funny enough, thanks to the air pollutions, the factory demolition process was delayed for about half a year, and we were able to get the final after demolishing shots. So 3 days in total, but only one day we could access the character. And we thought, if we can't see the character working in the factory very much, there's no way to really jump in and out and weave together with the story. So we only could choose a very minimal way to link the factory and the people. Yeah.
It's changed the things that can work for a documentary film, really, like air pollution.
Yes. Yeah. And that's how that's also the beauty of documentary filmmaking.
Yes, completely.
Yes, you just have to be constantly open with what's happening and take a brave choice, I guess.
Absolutely, yes. Well, if anybody has any comments and stuff, then we can wrap.
Thanks, a very deep film.
Thank you.
I haven't really seen so much of Chinese cinema, but I saw Still Life maybe 12, 13 years back.
All right.
And I thought that there were some sequences or even like aspects of what's happening, which reminded me a lot of that. Although there, from what I remember, is that it was really like massive frames and small things happening, but I really felt connected to that film. So just an observation.
Is there anything you'd like to ask, or just a?
No, I think it was just like an observation. Okay. It's funny you should say this, because this film also reminded me, apart from Jiaqing, also reminded me of this film, Lixin Fan's film, The Last Train Home. Yeah, it's in terms of its narrative style, they are very they kind of speak to each other in my head, at least. Yeah.
Hi, I really like the film, and so I was wondering, was there at any stage of the filming or during the production process, there was a temptation to choose one family instead of two families, because there is also sort of similarity in the conflict. And the second part of the question is that at what stage for you guys the conflict became really clear that this is the thing that you're going to aim for, or this is the thing that you're going to follow? Or was it that you continuously continued doing multidimensional stuff, and then at a very later stage it became clear that you can focus only this micro aspect for the conflict in particular?
I'll answer a little bit first, then I'll let him tell a bit more. We followed 3 families actually, and we had about 200 hours of footage. In the end, we decided 2 family was just about enough to make this film comprehensible. So we left out the third family, which we felt if it was kept in, it would be very there would be a lot of repetitive aspect. But in our perspective, we felt the 2 families represented different. There were many things that each family provided that the others didn't. So in our mind, we felt it worked, because even though on the surface level they looked similar, but in fact they were really bringing different dynamics of family relationships. One, the caring grandmother trying to balance the family situation, trying to really care about all their children and make them happy. The other is perhaps a more conservative approach, and the hierarchy, the patriarchal father and the 5 children who don't get along at all. The other family is a lot warmer. People are kinder, I suppose, to each other, whereas the other one is more raw and they let out their emotions more directly. So just to add a bit more on the thematic value of having these two families to make the story whole, from the director's perspective, he felt this story was really about change, and then it's about the family dynamics. Perhaps it's we'd be very interested to hear what are the similarities and differences between Chinese families and Indian families. But for him, choosing to tell the family stories because it's a microcosm of society that we live in, and also because in this particular case in China, these families are the around the last group before the one-child policy. So we were able to capture how this kind of traditional family structure really got altered by society, like by external force, basically, and then how we're trying to adapt into a more nuclear and more pragmatic ways of family relationship. I hope that answers your question.
I've watched very few Chinese films, a couple of Japanese films, and I wanted to understand, is this an Asian cultural thing wherein, even though I sort of disagree with Ruchika in the sense that there is always a dialogue between the past and the present in all of the, in that Asian cinema, even though visual markers do not denote that, the past is always in conversation, there's always something at the back bringing in. But it seems to me coming more from a position of guilt, perhaps, that we are moving towards a future that is not our own. And it could be about sort of urbanization, industrialization, or simply aping the West, or all these ideas of what modernity comprises, and we're losing out on what we used to be. Is that an Asian, and it sort of reflects on the choices then in terms of subject matter, in terms of visual, or perhaps I've only watched those films that had that conflict. So do you think it's an Asian cultural thing that reflects, informs your choices in that sort of guilt about having to only demonstrate parts that are losing out? So we really need to put our community together, our tradition together and display it. Or is it just by like a coincidence?
No, I think it's you're absolutely right. This is we had exact same discussion when we were editing the film. In fact, we really felt, analyzing these people's stories and the choices they made in life, it really felt like, is this how Asian cultures like? Are we just all just guilt-tripping our children from generations to generations? But then, of course, as with anything in reality, there's also other sides, and we also felt, just looking at the history of what happened to these people and how societies were moving forward, despite all the flaws of communism in China and the recent development, rapid development, we could also see that this people are, they are another side of mentality that people are really trying to move ahead and trying to overcome. I think people are always trying to overcome the past guilt by using different things, whether it's socialism or whether it's economic and material convenience or technology. So I think yeah, we were trying. I think my answer would be we were always trying to find distractions from the guilt.
Okay, we must close now. Thank you very much, both of you.